My my name is Elaine Hightower, and I'm the Just Communities Program Manager. And like I said, we'll go ahead and get started while others are continuing to join. We are so glad that you joined us today. And we also welcome you to join our AP community of fellow travelers on a journey toward racial equity and climate resilience. Let's go to our next slide. If you are new to PSC, our mission is to advance policies and institutional actions that promote racial equity and shared prosperity for all and the growth of metropolitan Atlanta and the American South. Next slide. So the Partnership for Southern Equity has several portfolios that serve to dismantle and disrupt systems and silos. And those portfolios are the Just Growth portfolio, Just Health, who will be presenting today, Just Energy, Just Opportunity, the Organizing Unit, our Impact Unit, and Yes for Equity, which is our Youth Power Building arm. Next slide. Here at PSC, we ground ourselves in values and principles that address racial equity and climate resilience. Those principles are listed here on this slide, and they are: we operate on radical truth and understanding of history. We recognize the lasting impact of structural racism. We commit to healing and liberation. We honor the wisdom of neighbors and the power of community. We assert racial equity as the superior growth model. We commit to strategies that facilitate a just climate transition, and we leverage public policy for reform, repair, and reconciliation. Okay, next slide. So the Just Communities Protocol is a framework tool that is designed to put our principles and our values into practice. It's based around three core elements: pillars, commitments, and actions. This work is not simply just about a credential or the protocol, but it's a vehicle for community building. And we appreciate you being here, and we invite you to join us on the front lines of change and to give voice to these complicated issues around development and climate resilience. Next slide. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you our Just Health team, who's led by Robyn Bussey, who is the director, and she will present today alongside of Abby Cohen and Jonathan Santos, who are both research consultants. And their bios are on the screen for your review later. But without further ado, I'll turn it over to Robyn.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, wherever you are. We're glad that you could be here with us, and thank you for inviting us today. I'm really glad to be here, particularly with my colleagues, Abby and Jonathan. We don't get to do this very often, so this is a great treat for us. We are 60% of the Just Health team. We have two other members that couldn't be with us today, so we're really glad to be here with you all. So we can go ahead and get into it. Next slide. So we are going to talk about one of our favorite things, health equity. And just know this is something that we could talk about literally all day, something we do talk about all day. We're going to just give you a really high level overview. This is really pulled from our signature training called Why Health Equity Matters. It's a training that we do all over for lots of different groups, for community members, for organizations, businesses, public health organizations. It really depends. And we can do this. We've done it in an hour or less. We've done it in 2 days. We can do it in half days. So just know it's a lot of information that we are just giving you a really high level overview of. So there's a lot that we won't get to, but we're going to save some questions for the end. And hopefully, as we continue to go through this work and work with you all over time, we'll definitely get more into this. So just understand we're not going to go into a lot of it. So please give us some grace there. So we'll get into it. Next slide. So what we're going to do today is really just give you a high-level introduction about who we are as Just Health. We're going to talk a little bit about the language of health equity, the words, the narrative that we use, which is really important because we want to make sure we know what we're talking about when we talk about health equity. We're going to talk about the foundation of inequity. How do we get here? What makes things inequitable for folks? Why are people not really able, certain people not able to achieve good health? And then we're going to talk a little bit about some steps we can take to start to advance toward health equity. And then, of course, we'll leave some time for questions and hopefully discussion at the end. Next slide. So Just Health, we are the health equity portfolio, of course, at PSC. We contribute to PSC's mission by working to advance health equity so that all Black people and other marginalized groups have what they need as individuals and communities to thrive and be healthy. And we emphasize Black people because, again, we work toward the freedom and liberation of Black people. Once Black people have their freedom and liberation, so goes everyone else. So that's why we call that out. We do this by providing training, technical assistance, and policy advocacy to support community members, organizations, and anyone who wants to be a champion for health equity. So ultimately, we want to grow advocates for the advancement of health and racial equity all over the American South and hopefully all over the country. Next slide. So we're going to get into the language of health equity. Again, we are very adamant about words meaning things. If you sometimes it's very easy to use words differently, interchangeably. If you do, you're not a bad person. It's okay. We just want to make sure that folks kind of know what they're talking about when they're talking about health equity. There's some words you're going to see here that you probably heard that you probably even use sometimes that, you may be using a little bit differently. We just want you to kind of understand what they mean. And it's very important that we do this because when we start to do this work, we again want to make sure we're coming from a common place. Next slide. So these are words that you've probably again seen. I'm sure everyone knows the difference. You probably have seen the boxes. People love the boxes, the people standing on the boxes watching the game. We kind of get away from the box. We have a diagram or an infographic that we use that we really love that we didn't have time to show here. We used it as a game, but we didn't have time to do this. But we really want to focus on two key terms, equality versus equity. And these are the definitions, of course. Equality is everyone having access to and the distribution to resources evenly across all population groups. And equity is that access and distribution of resources according to need. And we like this really simple definition. Equality is everyone having a pair of shoes. Equity is providing everyone a pair of shoes that fit. So again, we can apply this to anything. When you think about things like green space. There are parks all over. Lots of neighborhoods have parks, but of course, some neighborhoods have parks with lots of lovely amenities. Some neighborhoods have parks with patches of dirt. So when people are really advocating for better green space, we have to really understand what it is they need and what it is they're asking for. So when we talk about equality and equity, we really want to make sure we're using those terms the right way. Next slide. This is the definition that we often lean on when we talk about health equity. This is CDC's definition. It's relatively current in the health equity space. This is super current. Health data it really lags. 2022 is probably cutting edge for us. So this is, again, a definition that we like. There's some things that we think that can be improved upon, but this is the definition we're currently using. Health equity can be achieved when every person can attain his or her full health potential. Again, we're kind of advocating for it to be their health potential, and no one is disadvantaged from achieving this position because of social position or other socially determined circumstances. So again, that includes race, gender, where people live, who people love, their education level, things that people don't necessarily they're not born with, things that people can adjust, things that are assigned to people. So we want to make sure that these things are not barriers to people achieving good health. So this is the definition we try to apply generally when we discuss health equity. Next slide. This is where things we think get a little tricky. And this again is where you're not going to get your hand slapped if you start to talk about health disparities. Health disparities is probably the word that you hear, or the term you hear most often when folks are talking about the things that are going on in the world. When you hear about particularly things like maternal mortality, when you hear things about cancer rates or rates of chronic disease and all the disparities between populations. Disparities is okay, but we really want you to understand the nuance. So disparities are just plain differences, and that's all they are. They're differences in health and mortality across groups, which can sometimes be expected. And I'll give you an example of that. But what we really want to dive into, what we want to focus on are those health inequities, those differences that are systemic and avoidable and unjust. So a disparity, again, just being a difference is something like cancer rates between age groups. So if you usually expect to see higher rates of cancer among older groups versus younger groups, just because folks tend to live longer, they have more exposure. So you tend to see more cancer rates among folks who are older. Now, health inequities, that looks like cancer morbidity rates between Black women and white women, particularly for breast cancer. White women and Black women tend to be diagnosed with breast cancer at the same rates, but again, Black women tend to die from breast cancer at a higher rate than white women, not because of race. Race is a social construct, there's no biological basis for race, but for systemic issues like late screening, not having access to insurance, a lot of different reasons, exposure to toxins and things like that. So that's what a real health inequity is, and that's what we focus on. So these terms are definitely used interchangeably, and they probably will continue to be. But when you hear health disparities, you have to think about, is it actually a disparity or is it an equity that we're talking about? Is that we want to address the inequity versus the disparity? Next slide. So you've probably seen this graphic before, but this is the social determinants of health breakdown. These are the things that make us healthy. As you see, only 20% of what contributes to our health is healthcare. It's actually going to the doctor, it's taking your meds and things like that. 80% of what contributes to our health are those social factors, social economic factors, your physical environment, your health behaviors. Those are the things that are caused by basically outside factors, things that have to do with where you live, with how you live, with things that are really assigned or put upon you. And most of what we invest in this country is the 20%, is the healthcare. That's where we're not seeing a return on our investment. The things that we have to invest in are that 80%, those kind of ugly, nebulous things that we can't see an immediate change in, things that we have to really address. It forces us to name things. It forces us to really take a longer look and a deeper look at issues that have caused us to be unhealthy and that contribute to our poor health. Social determinants of health are what we're trying to rename. Again, words mean things. Social drivers of health are those things, again, that you can't really always put a finger on. It's not actually a product. So that's something that we have to learn to differentiate, and we have to really change our thinking when we're talking about achieving good health. How can we learn to kind of change our mindset as a country, as a nation, and really start to invest in those upstream things that's going to actually improve our health as a community, as a population. And again, when we're investing in these things, those are the things that, again, force us to think about ugly truths. We have to think about our history. We have to think about our policy. We have to change our values, the things, again, that are not often easy to change, and they take a long time to change. So that's where the will of changing or investing in the 80% really comes into play. So now we'll go to the next slide. So this is, again, that ugly truth that we have to discuss. Structural racism is the enemy of equity. It refers to the system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representatives, and other norms work in various and reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. So these are the things, again, that it's hard to name. It's hard to specifically point out for some folks. And again, the thing that people don't often want to name people, I'm like saying generally, decision makers, certain populations. I think we've seen that in recent weeks. The things that people don't want to agree on or really call out. These are things that we see again in our healthcare system when, there's the notion that Black folks don't experience pain the same, or not respecting people's cultures when you're trying to treat certain folks. We see it in housing, low quality housing in certain neighborhoods, divesting in certain neighborhoods, or developments that drive out legacy residents. We see it in the education system with higher suspension rates for Black and Brown kids. And we see it along the lifespan. So we see it, in birth, with, lower birth rates for, I'm sorry, lower birth weights for Black and Brown children versus white children, all the way up to things you'd be surprised. Menopause. Black women experience menopause in different ways than white women. So that's the thing that we have to attack, the structural racism, the things that we really have to address when we're talking about advancing health inequity. So that's the part that we have to focus on. We have to really get away from those downstream investments, those downstream things that we focus on, things like community gardens that are really great, they're really great, but that's not going to get us to really changing the system that we need to change. We have to think about how do we change those policies, how do we repair those harms to really change the system to start again to move us toward health equity. So with that, we're going to move to the foundations. Oh, I'm sorry. This is our recaps. These are all the words, all the terms that we use. This is your cheat sheet to think about how you talk about health equity. So now we're going to move to those foundations of how did we get here? How did we get to health inequity? And I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan.
Thanks, Robyn. All right, y'all. So we're going to talk about in this section how we got here. How did this world become so inequitable? And we're going to start off with a quote by this gentleman right here. For those who don't know this man right here, his name is James Baldwin. He was an American writer and playwright who became a prominent figure in the civil rights movement. He was a very important literary voice who discussed race relations and queer identity in the 60s and 70s. And one of the things he's taught us and said that we kind of, at Just How, we kind of like to resonate and discuss a little bit is a quote by him. One of the things that have always afflicted the American reality and the American vision is the aversion of history. History is not something you read about in a book. In a book, excuse me. History is not something you read about in a book. History is not even the present. It's even in the past, it's in the present. Next slide. All right, y'all. So why does history matter? It's very important for us to understand history in order to make sense of the current inequities that many communities of color face. History provides us with a critical lens to analyze the present. So by analyzing the past, we identify systemic issues, challenges, and biases that help address these disparities. So many times, as planners and developers, we become profit focused and we forget to learn from the past. We don't realize as planners and developers how much power we actually have to influence the present and the future. Next slide. So here are just some examples of what Robyn was discussing, how systemic racism impacts all social sectors. And here are some examples that we have in the health sector that we like to discuss. So we'll start off with the Tuskegee experiment, which was a involuntary experiment more so. It was an experiment conducted from 1932 to 1972, and it was to study the effects of untreated syphilis in Black males. There were 600 men that were chosen for the experiment. 399, which had syphilis, were given a placebo instead of actual treatment. These placebos were continuously given to these Black men even after penicillin was discovered and used to treat syphilis in 1947. They were continued to give the placebo up until 1972. And in 1972, it kind of just blew up and everybody got exposed. But the whole experiment led to a lot of unnecessary death and suffering. So that's one thing that we do recognize as racism, like a real evidence of racism in the health sector. Another example we'd like to discuss is the Southern farmer's burden. So this is the middle cartoon right here. And this was a cartoon that was actually released in the 1920s with an article from the CDC. And basically, for those who don't know, Atlanta, Georgia used to be a malaria zone. So this is why the CDC is headquartered in Atlanta. Um, but the whole thing here is that the CDC, when they released this article and this picture, they never discussed the health impacts it was to black farmers, black farmhands. So many of these black farmhands at the time were living in swampy areas in Atlanta where a lot of mosquitoes were living and breeding and all that. However, the article was very specifically aimed towards white farmers to discuss how much profits they were actually going to lose as a result of their black labor becoming sick or becoming sick with malaria. So in reality, it's kind of crazy to think that, the CDC, which is supposed to prioritize people's health, at the time of their creation was prioritizing the profit of white farmers as opposed to the health of black farmers. So that's just another example of racism in the health sector. And the last thing we'll talk about, another example of racism in the health sector, is forced sterilization. So there's several examples of this happening throughout history, and some of them mostly being in the South and in North Carolina, for example, from 1950 to 1966, Black women were sterilized 3 times more than the rate of white women, which is kind of crazy to think about. 1966 is really not that far off, not too long ago. But these uh, these sterilizations became so frequent, especially in the South. There's actually another famous activist. Her name is Fannie Lou Hamer, and Fannie Lou actually forced hysterectomy in Mississippi, and they were so common in Mississippi. They were began to be known as Mississippi appendectomies. So yeah, so with Fannie Lou Hamer, she was a child when she was sterilized. What happened was the doctor had told her that she had a uterine tumor and basically removed her entire uterus without telling her. So she had a whole entire it was a whole entire thing, but this is what made Fannie actually become a activist later on. And probably the more famous sterilization story that we do talk about is in 1973, you have the sisters Mary Alice Ralph and Minnie Ralph, who were 12 and 14 at the time, that went involuntary sterilizations in Alabama. So officials actually tricked their mother into agreeing to this and signing off on these procedures, even though there was no consent on each side. And these sterilizations happened throughout, the 20th century. And this is, 1973, like that's, not too far gone. So it's actually kind of crazy that these things actually are still happening, or, discrimination, and they look different now. Racism in the health sector might not be, forced sterilizations or, weird experiments, but folks are still being discriminated against, and there are a lot of, disparities that Robyn was talking about, which happen to Black and Brown folks as a result of neglect or, not given the proper attention when you're seeing a doctor. So yeah, these are just some examples that we like to talk about as we talk about racism, systemic racism in the health sector. Next slide. All right, y'all. So redlining, which is another important topic for our work. For those that don't know who redlining is, quickly, redlining was a discriminatory practice where financial institutions like banks and other developers like real estate developers use color-coded maps, like the maps that you see right here, to systemically deny mortgages and loans and other services to Black and Brown folks in neighborhoods. So they literally, like in the 1930s, the Federal Housing Department administration, who was really responsible for drawing up these lines, they would literally take a red marker and basically outline areas in neighborhoods where they were marking them as hazardous or unfit or unworthy for investment. And because of those, redlining practices that were happening and discriminations that were happening in the past, they continue to impact food security, violence, poverty, transportation issues, all of these things in our current lives. So now, and this has happened throughout the entirety of the United States. This is not an isolated area, not an isolated situation. These redlining was happening throughout the entire United States. So in many cities, even if you start paying attention, if you never heard of redlining before, you'll start to see there are certain neighborhoods and certain parts of the city in which you know, the neighborhood is divested in. No one invested in those neighborhoods. And this is because of redlining practices from the past, from the 1950s, from the 1930s. And it continues to exist today. Next slide. And this is just a little quote from the Washington Post. Compared to white people, Black and Latino Americans live with more smog and fine particulate matter from cars, trucks, buses, coal plants, and other nearby industrial sources in the areas that were redlined. Those pollutants inflame human airways, reduce lung function, trigger asthma attacks, and can damage the heart and cause strokes. So one of the things that this actually reminds me of, I was actually at a conference in Detroit this past maybe like 2 months ago. And the keynote speaker was this young woman from Los Angeles. She was about 23 back in September. I'm not sure when her birthday was, but she was telling us the story of how growing up, she lived across the street from a oil refinery station. For those that don't know, LA is the biggest oil refinery city in the world, well, at least in the country, at least. Don't quote me about the world, but definitely in the country. And the craziest thing about LA is that you don't really see these oil refinery stations. They're masked behind buildings and towers and all of these things. So, it looks like a pretty neighborhood. You don't realize anything, but right behind those walls is like a whole oil refinery station, all those things. And there's signs all over these refinery stations that say, according to the law in California, this can cause cancer, X, Y, and Z. So with this young woman's story, which was crazy, was that, she told the story of how growing up, she would see these signs and play by these, refineries all day, every single day for years. And then in 2020, she went to the doctor and turns out she has cervical cancer at the age of 20, which is something that, no 20-year-old should be having. So it actually, every time I read this quote from the Washington Post and think about redlining, I think of that story because it's crazy because her family, being a Latina American in America, she was placed, her family's grown up there, lived there for years. So the fact that, the evidence and the effects of redlining, whether that is because of industrialization or oil refinery, like we see here, they have an impact on our lives. And as planners and developers, I feel like we do have an impact on what we say to what we say to these oil refineries, like all these oil companies that are trying to have oil refineries in the neighborhoods. So definitely just food for thought, and definitely just like, just a concrete example of how this actually affects people on a day-to-day basis. So for the next slide, I believe we will be moving on to more actionable steps on how we can advance health equity, and I'll be passing it on to Abby.
Um, we can move. Hopefully we're good. But Robyn and Jonathan did a great job of kind of outlining how there are multiple factors that can you guys hear me?
Your sound is a little distorted.
Can you hear me now? No?
That's better.
I think it's better.
Okay. Let me know if it's a problem. I'll just keep my video off for now. But so Robyn and Jonathan did a great job of kind of outlaying all the different ways that, these things that are maybe don't seem tied to our health kind of actually do affect our well-being. So when we think about how we can advance health equity, it's way more than just about, increasing healthcare access. It's about addressing root causes that create these inequities in the first place. See, you almost caught me, Robyn, switching up disparities and inequities. We all do it. Um, but this means removing systemic barriers like poverty and discrimination, which often manifest themselves as limited access to well-paying jobs, quality education, safe neighborhoods, and reliable healthcare. So it advancing health equity, in short, really requires a holistic approach, and it requires kind of collaboration across sectors. So, we will succeed when we have housing, education, economic folks all acting together, like addressing health issues. So these quotes just say advancing health equity requires removing obstacles to health like poverty, discrimination, and consequences, including powerlessness and lack of access to good jobs with fair pay, quality education, and housing, safe environments, and healthcare. And the second point is really about valuing everyone equally. So matching resources to need and addressing historical and contemporary injustices. In plain terms, I think of that as just meeting folks where they're at. When we think about, Robyn, when she gave the definition of equity, it wasn't about everybody getting shoes. It was everybody getting shoes that actually fit. So we can move on to the next slide. Another key aspect of advancing health equity is always, always, always considering that people who are closest to the problem are going to be closest to the solution. They have a better vantage point of the situation. And so, as planners, as developers, as community activists, we need to constantly be asking ourselves, whose voice are we amplifying here? And who are we missing from the conversation? And kind of along those lines, you have to constantly kind of have that dialogue with yourself, with your team, with your community. Like, how are we ensuring that our community is at the decision, is at in the lead position and driving the decision-making process? So I think in short, like the two basic go-to ways I think about advancing health equity are really meeting people where they're at and valuing perspectives of community members and those closest to the problem. But let's get into a little bit more tangible because that's still kind of high level. So those are things to keep in mind. But if we move to the next slide, we can start to really see how advancing health equity, it requires action. We like to think about it on three different levels, right? So there's the individual level actions, which it's just starting from the ground. Those are the roots, we have to address our internal biases and the way we think about the world. That is a big piece of this. And then kind of next up is really looking at our organizational level actions, how we're working as a group, how we're working as a team. Are we prioritizing community engagement? Are we, allocating resources equitably? And we'll get a little bit more into the specifics, but just really understanding how there's different levels of action. And the final level is really policy level. So this is focusing on structural changes that affect entire populations. So it could be related to affordable housing or addressing environmental injustices. Like I said, the key to our success with advancing health equity is really going to be a matter of working across sectors. But let's first start off, if we move to the next slide, we can explore a little bit about what individual actions you can do to start advancing health equity on a broader level. And like I said, it first really just starts off with recognizing and challenging the bias that we all hold. In some way or another, it's really just it's rooted in there, you know, from day one. Society has a funny way of kind of baking us with these false ways of looking at the world. So we have to kind of unlearn those. And that is an important piece to advancing health equity. And along those lines, it's really educating ourselves and our loved ones about racial and health inequities, not disparities, inequities. um, and you can start to advocate when you understand, when you have an accurate picture of, you know, the inequities that you're up against, of the biases that you and your loved ones hold, then you can start to advocate for equity in your smaller circles. Moving forward. So organizational actions, like I said, prioritizing the community engagement. So whose voices are we hearing? And so this could look like partnering with diverse groups, making sure that you're centering underserved and marginalized folks, especially in key decision processes, not just, oh yeah, I asked them if this is okay and I got a checkbox off of it. Really engaging folks in from the very get-go in the design and planning of things. And then also consistently looking for feedback. So it's never just a one and done with community engagement. And it should be an iterative process. It should be something that you're always going back to the community to have them kind of act as your compass. They are your true north. And along those lines, leveraging data. So using evidence-based strategies, um, kind of looking at metrics and benchmarks so you know where you're at in your journey. Am I making a change on things? Am I not? Are there any unintended outcomes from what I'm doing? And along the lines of prioritizing community engagement, always looking to, when appropriate, when possible, to use participatory methods, meaning we're engaging folks in data collection and encouraging community ownership of data. So we're not just collecting data so our organization can, you know, go file for a grant and build this thing. No, that is as a way of the past, and we have to move kind of towards this collective ownership of the data that we are collecting. So finally, we can move on to policy level actions. And this, like Robyn said, this is such a brief overview of all of the things that we can do to advance health equity, but we wanted to give you kind of some key touch points that you can start to think about, right? So improving transportation systems, and going back to this idea that, you know, policy actions that affect health equity are not just going to be in the public, like not necessarily health specific policies. It's going to look like improving transportation systems because, yeah, when you have better transportation, it's easier to access your doctors and caregivers. Addressing housing inequities, because when we can afford housing, and then we can afford a lot of other things, and our quality of living goes well. So part of health equity is really understanding how interconnected our health is with these other factors going on behind the scenes. And then another area that we'd encourage you to look at is designing for food and nutrition access. So supporting zoning for farmers market and grocery stores, promoting urban agriculture, and incentivizing folks to offer healthy options. So again, really kind of this list could go on and on and on. These are some main kind of topics: housing, transportation, and food access, that are a good place to start. And so now we can really open it up for questions, thoughts, reactions to everything that we just threw your way.
Do you have anyone with any questions? You can throw them in the Q&A portion. We have a lot of discussion in the chat. Let me go over here. So Janelle has a lot to offer, as always, open to dialogue. meet people where they're at exactly.
There is a question in the Q&A, and someone did ask if you could display the recap slide, I guess, of the terms that we used. And someone asked, can we provide examples of the intersection of health, equity, and energy? Absolutely. So that's one of the things that we work on. So one of the things we work on is definitely the intersection of climate and health. And one of the communities that we work in, we have a couple of our community members on, Rosario and Franklin. Hey, y'all. In this work, we were looking at the intersection of climate and health. And one of the things our community members, again, thinking about community-led work, wanted to focus on is energy burden, the high energy burden that occurs in their community. And when we look at that, again, on its face, you just think about, okay, people are paying higher energy bills, but what does that mean? For one, it means when you're paying you're giving a higher amount of your income towards your energy bill, that's taking away from a lot of other things, right? So immediately that could be taking away from affording your medications, that could be taking away from buying healthier food. That's probably, a direct connection. But it also means that your house may not be weatherized. So that might mean if it's an extremely hot day, then you're sitting in a really hot home, and that may lead to heat stroke, or it may exacerbate some other chronic diseases that you may have. It could also mean, you're in a home that is not, that may have mold or some other issue, and that heat again is making that worse. So there's a lot of ways that we can kind of connect energy to health and health inequity, climate and health inequity. I hope that's a really quick and dirty example, if that helps. Ooh.
A couple more questions in the chat, and I'll stop there.
So
Okay.
I was gonna say I see Mary's question about kind of ways that we can engage the community from the very beginning, especially in the early stages of program design. Mary, right on the money, especially in terms of like when you're engaging folks, like at the very get-go. I would say, Robyn, I'd love if we could find, and it's living in my head somewhere, but like the participatory tools. I know Jonathan and I put something together about different ways that you can engage folks to collect information and kind of start to understand things from their vantage point. One of my favorite exercises, which the Community Advisory Board for our Climate Change, Health, and Equity initiative, they actually conducted one, was a prioritization ranking. So like helping folks to kind of nail down what's important to them, and starting off from that point. But there's a few different tools that I would suggest. So let me see if I can find a link to that and share it with you. Great question.
Yeah, we'll share that.
Yeah. And also just like just to be like just like another like piece of advice, like especially when you're engaging community at the beginning, you want to just keep engaging them, not just at the beginning, but every step of the way, and trying to figure out ways to just check in, whether that's like after you collect data, after you start the initiative, after you actually complete the project, and just keep checking in with folks to make sure that what you're doing is actually what the community and what folks want. So that's definitely important as well.
There's a really hard question in the Q&A, how you keep going, remain optimistic in the current political environment. Whew, I think it's the work that has been done, particularly in community. This work has been going on, regardless of who's been in office. It's been going on for a really long time, for generations. There's a lot to look to. Again, we talk about history. So that helps to know that this is not necessarily a unique situation, that folks have persevered through other things. So, we got to go back to that resolve, and we got through that. We'll get through this. And as someone in our Just Health Academy said, bourbon, that helps too. That's probably not a healthy answer. Um, and then someone said, how will Project 2025, the new administration, play a role in your plan if we do not have the EPA to regulate? Again, I think that's going to come down to kind of some community-led work, some state level policies, just kind of doing, the best we can at, making sure that we have, some things in place to kind of do some monitoring on our own. Hopefully we have some policymakers that understand what the issues are and are willing to, support policies at the local level as much as possible. It's unfortunately it's kind of a wait and see for
Yeah.
sure.
Totally. And I see Brian asked the question, what are the key measures of the built environment at the neighborhood level important for identifying opportunities to reduce health disparities? So I love this question, and I also think it drives us to point to the idea that health equity means that we're meeting people where they're at. So which community are we talking about? What do community members see as like the most pressing thing to address that is affecting their health? I think posing that question specifically to the community that you're trying to work with is probably the key to that. Any answer I give is probably going to be a little bit off because every community is different. There's of course like statistics that you could look into and see trends. And I would love to see what, Jonathan and Robyn have to say if there's anything additional to that. But I would say start with asking your community that.
Mm-hmm. I agree, Abby, and I think it's just good practice. And it's like think about it, if we came and told you that these are the main issues that are affecting folks all around the city, whatever, it's not going to be accurate what Abby's saying. And on top of that, we come in, it makes us kind of be like there's a power dynamic here. And I wish we could have talked about a little bit about power in this presentation, but that's for like another time. But when you come in as like a specialist or think that you know everything about a community, sometimes that doesn't go so well. And many times you find that the projects that you end up doing in these communities, it doesn't become sustainable because there's no buy-in. People didn't see that as the major issue, or they didn't see that as a problem, but yet it was prescribed to them by so-called us professionals. But in reality, it's these folks that are on the ground that live in these communities every single day that understand more about their communities and what affects them than we do. So putting it back on the residents and people that you're working with and really trying to figure out what they deem as the problem, I think is really necessary and being the first step to figure out, what is the issue here and how can we actually, start addressing those issues. Also, many times it's not really just issues. There's a lot of strength assets that you could find in a community that sometimes will be a nice springboard to start a project. And many times we are just conditioned with, there's an issue, there's a problem, and we don't tend to focus on the good things that are actually happening and how we can build those good things up.
Yeah. Yeah, I would absolutely agree. And like everything that you named, those are certainly good things. They're like evidence-based things and they're great. But again, if when the community comes back and says, I'll use one of your examples, when they say we need more childcare, great. You can go and pull the data and say these are the things around or policies around childcare that we know to be true and they work. But again, the community has led you to this issue. So you can come with with your data, with your support, but you didn't necessarily go in and say, we think childcare is going to be the answer to your issue. So it's definitely kind of going in, providing kind of that convening framework first, working with the community, providing those tools that we talked about for participatory research and things like that. Once that issue is or issues are identified, then sharing data, using data, working together to co-design a solution for sure.
Any other questions for the Just Health team? We don't have enough special education programs in our community or adaptive programs. Great. Does anyone else have any questions for Just Health? If not, then I would like to thank our Just Health team for such a powerful presentation. And as we approach this topic from different vantage points of our work, keep in mind how health equity is so critical, not only to improve population health, but also to economic growth of communities and just the health of communities. When people are healthier, they're more productive. And so as we go about our work, keep those things in mind. And again, thank you, Just Health. And going forward next month to our webinar participants, we will not have a webinar next month, but we will reconvene in January after the new year. And I also invite you all to our Mingle and Munch that is scheduled for December the 4th. You should get something in your inbox soon. And have a great and wonderful Thanksgiving and Christmas holiday and into the new year.
Elaine, can I jump in with a couple of parting thoughts real quick?
Yes.
We let people go. Thank you so much, Just Health team. Y'all brought some really great thought-provoking ideas to this audience. I wanted to give a little bit of a teaser for those who really are tapping into these topics around health equity as they relate to just communities. Particularly, we will be working with this team to develop a workshop that will be, excuse me, a much deeper dive for the Just Communities AP community in the early part of the year. So stay tuned for more details on that. And we'd love to see you come back for a more interactive opportunity to learn together with this team and each other. And lastly, if this is your first exposure to Just Communities, want to make sure that you see on our website, justcommunities.info, that we now have our accredited practitioner training that is available in a self-directed form online. So please don't feel like you have to wait until early 2025 when we do our next Zoom live training. You can do the training at your leisure over holidays. You got a little bit of extra time around breaks. For those of you who may have credentials with other credentialing bodies and are looking for end of year continuing education credits, we encourage you to look at this as an opportunity to get some additional education. So please take advantage of that. You'll learn about some of the information related to health equity in the wellness commitment area of the protocol. And stay tuned. We'd love to continue this conversation. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for having us. We appreciate it.
Have a great afternoon.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.